Hey guys, it's Eking-san. Hope you're doing well. I love me some games. Today I'm talking with ErgoDoctorHawk about our love of games, and a bit how we own our games, and some pros and cons to digital game ownership. I'd love to hear your thoughts down in the comment section. Let's get into it. Thank you so much for joining me today, Ergo. I'm excited to talk to you about digital game ownership and how it compares to physical game ownership and some of the problems we might run into going forward, and maybe some of the exciting things going forward, or at least ways that digital video game ownership has made life easier. So I thought it might be fun to just talk about really quickly maybe your history of game ownership and like from childhood until now, your experience with owning physical games versus digital games, and when you remember switching over to owning a lot of digital titles rather than physical discs or cartridges, and maybe if there was any point that you just decided that's a better way to go or not.
So, growing up in the 90s, of course, I played, all the classic consoles, the Nintendo, the Super Nintendo, the Sega Genesis, PlayStation, on and on, N64, etc. And I think the final console that I ever bought was the PlayStation 3 back in like '06 or something.
Sounds right.
So 2004 is when Half-Life 2 was released, and I was very excited. The only problem was that it required Steam in order to play.
Yes.
And that, of course, started the journey to using a digital distribution service for video games. I mean, I certainly hated it at first. I did, completely. I was like, this is the worst. I don't ever want to have to be forced to use this service. But over time, it's incredibly convenient. Like I said, I've been a PC gamer, since that point, just completely anyway. I think I do prefer the digital distribution.
What's the last physical game you remember buying?
Okay, so the last console I bought was the PS3. However, I did buy my friend's used 3DS.
Oh, nice.
And I bought the Link Between Worlds, I believe, for that one. And what about you, sir? What was the last physical game you bought?
I like physical games and owning physical games. So actually, yesterday, I got a new physical game. So I got Nier Replicant, the remake/remaster, which has been a lot of fun. But in general, I prefer to buy cartridges or discs when I can. But in many cases, like you're saying, buying a digital title is very convenient, and in some ways it's the only way you can go. So I guess my history is very similar. We grew up in the same period. So yeah, owning different consoles, starting with Intellivision actually, is the earliest one I remember. But then the Nintendo, Super Nintendo, PS1, PS2, N64, GameCube, and then PS3. I think I agree. That's about the time that I remember starting to buy games digitally was on PS3, or at least in that era. And then Steam, definitely. I think most of the digital titles I bought were through Steam, especially early on. And since then, I probably buy most of my digital games through Steam. But I was a PC gamer, I would say in the 2000s, but in the past 10 years, I've been more of a console pleb, I guess. But for me, yeah, there's something about picking up a disc and putting it in, and then just knowing you have that disc, and you don't have to worry about your connection or what might happen if you can't download it in the future. And I guess that's sort of the concern that prompted this discussion. So I'm thinking now we could talk about some pros and cons of digital ownership. So we both mentioned the convenience factor is definitely there. I think a big con to me is that in a lot of these license agreements, you don't actually own the game itself. You own access to it, and you could lose access to it. So if they shut down Steam, or if they shut down the PlayStation network or the Xbox network, then you may lose access to some of these titles. So that's been a big concern for me. Can you think of any other cons to digital ownership?
Primarily, like you said, if you can't get access, via the internet, then you're without the game that you spent money on. You don't technically own it, like you said. My general concern in regard to digital games is that I will, in all likelihood, lose access to some, if not all of them, at some point.
Yeah.
Now, I think that primarily because, in general, I think our society all over the world is going to crash, and we're going to basically, fall back a bit, in which case, gaming's not really my biggest concern, so whatevs.
Sure. It is a luxury. So to be worried about the status of games that you own, yeah, you're in a pretty good position if that's your biggest concern.
Yeah. I do have a few pros, actually, aside from convenience.
Sure, go for it.
So, the thing about physical copies is, one, you can't find them very often, right? Like, it's hard to go out and find these things.
For sure. Two,
what I really enjoy about digital versions of games is that, like, the longer it goes, like, without buying it, I always say, and almost like I wish I were sponsored by, isthereanydeal.com, because I can go and get a game I've been waiting for like 80% off of the base price eventually.
Yeah.
So I can get a bunch of games for super cheap, and that is awesome. And you can't really do that with physical media, especially with Nintendo. Nintendo never drops their prices.
Yeah. Though you make a really good point there. I was thinking of all the Steam titles that I own that I've gotten for super cheap, and especially since you've shown me isthereanydeal.com. Not sponsored, but would like to be. That is a really nice factor, but something I didn't mention about physical games is the resale market, which maybe is a little bit comparable, but it is often hard to find deals that are comparable to like what you're describing, especially for something like Nintendo games. They really hold their value. But I would say that most of the physical games I've bought in my life have actually been secondhand. So I visit like GameStop and buy their pre-owned titles and other like local gaming stores that sell pre-owned games and also hardware. But that's one thing I like about physical discs as well, is the resale market.
I can see that. The question I have, of course, is does the ability to resell games outweigh the overall cost of purchasing physical media instead of savings you'd get purchasing digital media?
Yeah, I don't know. That's a good question. I've never like gone back and looked at my actual savings. There is something nice about having physical games in another sense. I don't have to worry about downloading most of the time, I would say. Sometimes it can be obnoxious. You have a physical disc, but then you have to download a 60 gigabyte update for it. So then it's like, what's the point?
Right, a day one patch.
Yeah, exactly. Some games and some studios are better than others about that. But a lot of the time, like for instance, on PS Vita, if I buy a PS Vita cartridge, it basically works. I don't think I really need to download anything else. Or like a Switch cartridge. For the most part, it'll work without having to hassle with too many other things. If you buy digital, then you have to start wrestling with maybe hard drive space, which on a PC isn't bad, but on a console sometimes can be a pain to deal with.
Yeah, I remember those days on my PS3 when I'd reach the edge and I'd be like, all right, I guess I'll delete this game. I haven't played it in a while.
Yeah, exactly. But this also reminds me of something interesting that's been happening with digital releases of games. I think it's like a double-edged sword, is that those huge update files that you have to download, it's not just the download time and the drive space and all that, but it feels like studios will launch a game knowing that they can fix things later. Cyberpunk is probably a really great example of this. You couldn't do that 15, 20 years ago. You couldn't launch a half-finished game. There was no distribution method to fix the problems in it. Whereas now it's like studios can get away with doing that.
Yeah, that's a huge thing with digital games, and I feel like that's kind of a shifting thing that I've kind of gotten used to in general. Though I do prefer if they're a little more honest up front and being like, hey, this is like early access. Like if they tell you it's early access, it's like, fine, cool. But when they do stuff like they did with Cyberpunk, that does piss me off in general.
Yeah, tempered expectations are good. It's terrible when you hype something up to a crazy degree and then it has to be patched over months. I still don't even know what playable state it's in. And then, yeah, Bethesda is really bad about that with Fallout and like the Elder Scrolls, several of the Elder Scrolls titles when they first launch. But yeah, on balance, do you feel like if a new game comes out and it's physical or digital, I know you don't buy a lot of new games, neither do I, but do you have a preference?
I mean, like I said, for the last 3 years, I've only bought digital, so I'm basically sticking with that.
Okay, there you go. So yeah, I still prefer the physical. But one reason I wanted to have this chat was this recent event of Sony announcing the closure of the PS3 and PS Vita stores, and then announcing just a few weeks later, they're like, nope, we're reversing this. So on March 29th, on Polygon, it was published that the PlayStation Store was going to be shut down and that you could no longer purchase new titles. You could download the old ones that you'd already purchased, but you wouldn't be able to purchase anything new. This was a huge concern for me and a lot of people because there are a lot of indie games that had launched, even in the past couple of years on the PS Vita that were digital only. And so you could no longer get those as of this summer. And people in general were really upset. And so on April 19th, it was announced that Sony had reversed this decision. And what they said was, it's clear that we made the wrong decision here. And when we initially came to the decision to end purchasing support for PS3 and PS Vita, it was born out of a number of factors, including commerce support challenges for older devices and the ability for us to focus more of our resources on newer devices where a majority of our gamers are playing on. We see now that many of you are incredibly passionate about being able to continue purchasing classic games on PS3 and PS Vita for the foreseeable future, so I'm glad we were able to find a solution to continue operations. I was glad to see that. I went on a little bit of a purchasing spree in anticipation of them closing it down because there were some Persona titles on Vita that I wanted to be able to play. So I'm glad that the company actually listened to its consumer base and tried to keep them happy. I don't know how much it actually costs them to maintain this, but I think at least in this instance, it's a good move. I don't know. Do you have any thoughts?
My main thought is that there was probably so much panic buying that they made like more than enough to maintain the servers and whatever else for like the next 3 years.
You're probably right, yeah.
And so, in all likelihood, my crazy conspiracy theory is that every year or two, they're going to announce the closure of this thing. And as long as they get panic buys, they'll be like, okay, we made a mistake, we'll keep going. And then eventually, when they stop getting that result, they'll actually close it down.
God, it's so cynical, but I see your point. I'm concerned about that too. I wonder how much they made. It would be really interesting if that data ever sees the light of day to see if there really was panic buying. Because I know I did it. I'm sure I'm not the only one.
Right.
So it kind of raises the question for me, what you think long-term support for digital titles could look like. It sounds like you think maybe they'll be ransomed, where like if people don't pay for them, they go.
That is kind of how I think it'll happen, especially in regards to older consoles and or handhelds. When it comes to the PC market, as long as the actual distribution service is still alive, Steam, GOG, there's like a million of them now. I only use Steam just because I hate having 8 different programs to launch games from. Like Epic, I refuse to do Epic. At least, I refuse to pay them. I do get their free games.
Sure. I know what you mean, though, like running all these different launchers. So, off the top of my head, there's Steam, Epic, GOG, I think there's like Origins or something, and then Blizzard has their own. So, that's 5 different clients that you have to be running if you want access to all these games. Is pretty annoying.
Yeah, it's a lot of nonsense that I really don't feel like dealing with. And so I'm probably mainly stick with Steam. And honestly, I think that at least until our civilization collapses, Steam makes so much money, they're not going anywhere.
Yeah, I think that's one good thing about Steam is they have so much of their consumer base or their support tied up in the ownership of these digital titles. that if they ever had a hint of not supporting something, like, people would move away from it. So they have like a huge incentive to keep supporting games as long as they conceivably can, and they have the resources to do it for sure. So I guess that's all I had. Do you have any other thoughts about digital versus physical titles, or where you think this might go in the future? Do you think we'll eliminate physical titles altogether? Just everything will go digital?
I mean, if I were to make a prediction, I do think at some point, 95% of all game releases, and most media for that fact, will not be physical. I think that it will go fully digital. There will still be like, oh, this is the fancy director's cut release that you can buy for $100 and you get the actual disc. And that'll be like a fancy thing. But for the most part, I think actual physical media is dead.
Yeah, as much as I want it to keep going, I tend to agree with you. Like, with the latest console generation, there's already a digital-only version for them. And so it seems like things are moving that way. And, most brick-and-mortar media sales companies like GameStop have been losing money in recent years. So this trend seems to be moving that way. But, yeah, I don't know. I kind of wonder if there will always be sort of a niche market for these things in some capacity. Maybe one console platform will have physical, because there are a lot of people that are really intense about owning physical titles and getting these huge like pre-order bundles with all these different things. But yeah, I think everything will go digital for the most part.
Yeah, no, I think the vast majority of stuff will go digital, and then they'll probably just do limited runs of physical media for an extremely high price.
Yeah, it'll be kind of like a collector's item, basically.
Yeah.
It'll be a rarity rather than something more normal that people own. Okay, cool. Well, this was a lot of fun. So in summary, it sounds like digital media is convenient. It's
cheap.
Cheap, yes. It gives you a lot of flexibility in how you can manage your titles. You don't have problems of searching through things. But then there are these questions going forward about how much access there will be, especially with all these segmented platforms on PC, console, and otherwise. So it'll be interesting to see where it goes. Okay, thanks a lot, Ergo, for this conversation. I'm curious about what you folks that are listening think. Do you primarily buy your games digitally, or do you prefer physical copies when possible? Please let us know in the comments below. How do you think digital platforms will continue to support titles going forward? If you enjoyed this chat, please like and subscribe. Please also check out our Discord channel, linked in the description below. Thanks a lot, and see you next time.
See you in the next one.